December 7, 1941. 7:57 a.m., below the steel decks of the USS West Virginia, Doris Miller folded white linen with steady hands. The battleship rocked gently in Pearl Harbor's calm waters. Breakfast dishes had been cleared. Officers' laundry waited in neat piles. Another Sunday morning in paradise. Then the world exploded. The first torpedo struck with a sound like thunder trapped in a barrel. The ship lurched. Miller's feet left the deck. Somewhere above, metal screamed against metal. The lights flickered. Another impact, then another. The smell of fuel oil mixed with something burning. Smoke began curling down the passageways. 22 years old, a cook. Mess attendant, second class. In the United States Navy, that was as high as a black man could climb. Miller wasn't trained for combat. He wasn't trained for war. The Navy had made that clear from the moment he enlisted. But training doesn't matter when the world is on fire, Miller dropped the laundry and ran toward the chaos. What happened in the next 20 minutes would challenge everything. America believed about race, courage, and who deserved to be called a hero. Doris Miller was born on October 12, 1919, in Waco, Texas. His parents, Connery and Henrietta Miller, worked the land as sharecroppers. 4 sons, not much money. The Texas sun beat down on fields that never quite belonged to them. Doris was the third boy, named after a doctor his mother admired, though everyone would come to call him Dorie. School ended early. The Depression demanded it. At 13, Miller was working as a cook to help his family survive. He learned to feed people, to serve without complaint, to make something from nothing. His father taught him to hunt with small rifles in the woods outside Waco. He became a good shot. Strong, too. At Moore High School, he played fullback on the football team until the family needed him more than the team did. In September 1939, just before his 20th birthday, Miller walked into a Navy recruitment office. Europe was already at war. He wanted to see the world beyond Waco. He wanted to send money home. The recruiter looked at him and saw only one thing: his skin. In 1939, the United States Navy operated under a brutal calculus. Black men could enlist, but they could not fight. They could serve, but they could not lead. They could wear the uniform, but they could not man the guns. Executive policy confined them to the steward's branch, cooking, cleaning, serving meals to white officers. No exceptions. No appeals. No path forward. This was not unique to the Navy. Jim Crow laws poisoned every branch of the military, every corner of American life. Separate water fountains. Separate schools. Separate blood banks, even as men bled the same red blood. The Army was fully segregated. The Marine Corps refused to accept black recruits at all. Commandant Thomas Holcomb said he would rather have 5,000 whites than 250,000 African Americans. America preached democracy while practicing apartheid. Miller trained at Norfolk, Virginia, and was assigned to the battleship USS West Virginia. He served meals. He shined shoes. He made beds for officers who would never share a meal with him as an equal. He collected laundry. He did his job without protest, like thousands of other black sailors who understood the rules even if they despised them. By 1941, over 1.2 million African Americans would eventually serve in World War II. They would drive the trucks of the Red Ball Express, keeping Allied armies supplied. They would fly as Tuskegee Airmen, proving that black pilots could dominate the skies. They would fight in tank battalions and infantry divisions, often with inferior equipment and under racist white officers who doubted their courage. They would fight 2 wars. Simultaneously, a young man named James Thompson would write to the Pittsburgh Courier in January 1942, asking a question that burned in the hearts of black Americans everywhere. Should I sacrifice my life to live half American? The newspaper launched the WWII campaign. 2 victories. One against fascism abroad. One against racism at home. 2 fingers raised. 2 battles fought on 2 fronts. Black soldiers trained on bases in the segregated South, where they faced violence and degradation. They were called racial epithets by the men they served beside. Some wrote letters to the NAACP describing treatment like slaves, like dogs. They feared for their lives at the hands of their own countrymen, and yet they served. By late 1941, the USS West Virginia sat anchored at Pearl Harbor. Hawaii, part of the Pacific Fleet's imposing presence. Battleship Row. 9 massive warships lined up like steel sentinels. The West Virginia, nicknamed WWII, displaced over 32,000 tons, 16-inch guns, armored plating. A fortress on water. For Doris Miller, it was a kitchen. Life aboard ship followed rigid patterns. Black sailors lived separately from white sailors. They ate at different times. They slept in different quarters. They socialized in different spaces. Even in the vast machinery of modern warfare, America found ways to enforce the color line. Miller worked in the officers' mess, serving food to men who commanded the ship. He was good at it, reliable, strong enough to haul supplies, careful enough to handle the officers' personal belongings, but he was never allowed near the guns. Across the Pacific, tensions with Japan had reached a breaking point. The United States had imposed oil embargoes. Japan needed resources for its war in China. Negotiations in Washington had collapsed. Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto planned a strike that would cripple American naval power in one devastating blow. On November 26, 1941, a Japanese carrier strike force departed from Hitakapu Bay, 6 aircraft carriers, over 400 planes. They sailed in radio silence across the northern Pacific, hidden by weather and distance. The attack plan called for 2 waves. Torpedo bombers would strike the battleships. Dive bombers would destroy airfields. Fighter planes would strafe anything that moved. The Americans suspected nothing. December 7th, 1941, began like any other Sunday. Miller woke at 6 in the morning. Extra duty that day, room steward for the ship's officers. He made beds. He collected laundry. He shined shoes. He woke men who slept peacefully, unaware that 350 miles to the north, Japanese pilots were climbing into their cockpits. Miller served breakfast. Eggs, toast, coffee. The officers ate and chatted. Some planned to go ashore later. Sunday was Liberty Day for those who had it. The morning sun climbed over the harbor. The water sparkled. Palm trees swayed on Ford Island. Paradise. At 7:48 a.m., the first Japanese planes crossed the northern shore of Oahu. They descended through scattered clouds. Pilots saw the American fleet spread below them like toys in a bathtub. Not a single fighter plane rose to challenge them. The anti-aircraft guns sat silent. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida radioed the code. Tora! 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 Tiger, tiger, tiger. Complete surprise achieved. Miller was below deck, gathering laundry from the officers' quarters. White uniforms, pressed trousers, the mundane duties of a mess attendant. In 9 minutes, 7 Japanese torpedo planes would launch their weapons at the West Virginia. The ship would take 2 armor-piercing bombs through her deck. She would begin to die, and Miller, the cook, the servant, the man trained only to feed others, would have to decide what kind of American he wanted to be. The Navy had given him no choice about his role. It had given him no training for battle. It had given him a uniform, but not the respect that should come with it. Yet when the moment came, when the explosions tore through the steel, when men screamed and bled and died, none of that would matter. 7 minutes now. Officers finished their coffee. Miller moved through the narrow passageways with his arms full of white fabric. The ship's rhythm continued, predictable and safe. Somewhere above, Japanese bombers aligned their approach vectors. Torpedo planes dropped to wave height. Fighters armed their guns. 3 minutes. At 7:57 a.m., the first torpedo struck. Miller felt it in his bones before he heard it. The deck heaved. The laundry scattered. He grabbed a bulkhead to stay upright. Another explosion. Then another. The ship shuddered like a wounded animal. Alarms shrieked through the passageways. Men shouted. Somewhere, someone screamed. General quarters. Miller's battle station was an anti-aircraft battery magazine amidship. He ran through smoke, through sailors scrambling in every direction. Up ladders, past men already bleeding. The ship listed to port. Water rushed through torn metal. Oil spread across flooded compartments. He reached his station. It no longer existed. A torpedo had torn through the hull exactly where Miller should have been standing. Twisted steel. Fire. Bodies. If he had been at his post when the torpedo hit, he would already be dead. Instead, he was alive and needed. Miller climbed to the bridge. Chaos. The bridge crew struggled with a man covered in blood. Captain Mervyn Bennion, 47 years old, Naval Academy graduate. A fragment from a... Bomb blast on the nearby USS Tennessee had torn through him. The captain could not move, could not speak clearly. The wound was mortal, though he did not yet know it. Miller did not hesitate. He was a cook. The captain was white. The Navy's rules said Miller existed to serve, not to touch officers except in the course of his duties. But those rules came from a world that made sense. That world had just exploded. Miller lifted the captain. 190 pounds of his own muscle against a dying man's weight. He carried Bennion away from the exposed bridge to a place with more cover. The captain's blood soaked Miller's uniform. Japanese planes screamed overhead. Bombs whistled. The ship groaned. Miller set the captain down as gently as war. Aloud. Then he looked for what else needed doing. The bridge held a weapon Miller had never been trained to use. A Browning .50 caliber anti-aircraft machine. Gun. Belt-fed, air-cooled, capable of firing 450 to 600 rounds per minute, designed to tear aircraft apart at range, operated by trained gunners who understood trajectories, lead angles, ammunition feeds. Miller was not a trained gunner. He was a cook who had once fired hunting rifles in the Texas woods. An officer shouted for someone to load the guns. Miller moved to help. His hands found the ammunition belts. Heavy, he fed them into the receiver. The mechanism made sense even if he had never seen it before. Metal parts that fit together. A trigger. A sight. He looked up. The sky swarmed with Japanese planes. Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers. Aichi D-3A dive bombers. Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters. 353 aircraft in 2 waves. They dove and banked and strafed. The red circles on their wings flashed in the morning sun. They dropped death with mechanical precision. The West Virginia had already been hit by 7 torpedoes. 2 armor-piercing bombs had punched through the deck. Fire spread through compartments. Water rushed into the hull. Men drowned in flooded spaces. Others burned. The ship listed 9 degrees to port. Then more. Miller grabbed the gun. No one had shown him how. No instructor had walked him through the procedures. Black sailors were not allowed at the guns. That was policy. That was tradition. That was the way the Navy worked. Miller did not care about policy. He aimed at the nearest plane and squeezed the trigger. The gun roared to life. The recoil shook his shoulders. Tracers arced across the sky. He adjusted. Fired again. The belt fed through the weapon. Hot brass casings ejected and clattered on the deck. Planes dove. Miller tracked them. Fired. The noise was deafening. Explosions. Engines. Screaming metal. Screaming men. He fired until the ammunition ran out. While Miller fought on the bridge of the West Virginia, 1,200,000 other black Americans were preparing to fight a war that did not want them. They trained in segregated camps. They slept in segregated barracks. They ate at segregated tables. The military turned away black volunteers who held degrees from Harvard, who spoke multiple languages, who possessed scientific backgrounds that could have changed the course of the war. The reason was always the same: skin color. In Tuskegee, Alabama, young black men learned to fly. The Army Air Corps had refused them for years, claiming they lacked the intelligence and courage for combat aviation. Now, desperate for pilots, the military created an all-black unit, the 332nd Fighter Group. They would fly P-51 Mustangs over Europe. They would escort bombers deep into Germany. They would never lose a bomber to enemy fighters on their watch. They would become legends. The 761st Tank Battalion trained with M4 Sherman tanks. Come out fighting was their motto. They would land in France in October 1944 and fight for 183 consecutive days. General George Patton would tell them, "I don't care what color you are, so long as you go up there and kill those Kraut sons of bitches." The Red Ball Express would drive through the night. Black truckers hauling supplies from Normandy to the front lines. 6,000 trucks. 400 miles of road. Without them, the Allied advance would have stalled, and over all of them, German propaganda leaflets fell from the sky. "Why are you fighting for a country that lynches your people?" the leaflets asked. "Why serve a military that treats you as less than human?" The Nazis understood American hypocrisy. They mocked it. They weaponized it. Some black soldiers kept those leaflets. Not because they believed the enemy, but because the enemy was asking questions America refused to answer on night. December 15, 1941, 8 days after Pearl Harbor, the Navy released its commendations for heroic action. During the attack, the list included one unnamed Negro mess attendant, no name, no details, just a racial designation and a job title. The Navy acknowledged that someone black had done something brave. That was as far as official recognition went, but rumors spread through the fleet. Sailors who had been on the West Virginia talked. They had seen a black cook manning the anti-aircraft gun. They had seen him firing at Japanese planes while bombs fell around him. They had seen him carry the wounded captain. They had seen him help evacuate men from the sinking ship. Word reached the black press. The Pittsburgh Courier launched an investigation. Who was this unnamed hero? Why was the Navy hiding his identity? The NACP joined the pressure campaign. Black journalists demanded answers. This was not just about one man. This was about every black American who served in uniform while being denied basic dignity. The Navy resisted. 3 months passed. Finally, in March 1942, under mounting pressure, the Navy released the name Doris Miller. Mess Attendant 2nd Class, USS West Virginia. Pearl Harbor survivor. The first black American to be awarded the Navy Cross for Valor in combat. But many believed he deserved more. Congressman John Dingell of Michigan nominated Miller for the Medal of Honor. Senator James Meade of New York did the same. The black press campaigned vigorously. Miller's actions met every criterion. Extraordinary heroism. Risk of life. Above and beyond the call of duty. The Medal of Honor never came. The Navy Cross was unprecedented enough. America was willing to admit that a black cook could be brave. But the nation's highest military decoration? That remained a bridge too far for 1942. The official Navy record would later state that Doris Miller shot down 1 Japanese aircraft. Miller believed it was more. Years later, when asked about those minutes at the gun, he would say simply, "I think I got one of those Jap planes. They were diving pretty close to us." Eyewitnesses claimed he hit between 4 and 6. The truth became impossible to verify. Multiple ships fired anti-aircraft guns simultaneously. Bullets from the USS Tennessee, the USS Maryland, the Nevada, all converged on the same targets. When a plane exploded or spiraled into the harbor, who could say which gun delivered the killing shot? The chaos made certainty impossible. But sailors on the West Virginia's bridge saw what Miller did. They saw him grab the Browning .50 caliber with no training. They saw him figure out the ammunition feed by instinct. They saw him track planes through the sky while explosions rocked the deck beneath his feet. They saw him fire with a calm that should not have existed in that moment. Lieutenant Commander Dwyer C. Johnson was there. He would later testify to Miller's actions. Others confirmed it. A black mess attendant had manned a weapon he was never supposed to touch and had fought back against the empire that attacked his ship. The Japanese planes came in waves. First wave, 40 torpedo planes, 51 dive bombers, 43 fighters. They struck at 7:55 a.m. The West Virginia took 6 torpedoes in the first 15 minutes. Each one tore a hole in the hull the size of a truck. Water flooded in at thousands of gallons per minute. The ship began to list dangerously to port. Lieutenant Claude Ricketts, the assistant damage control officer, made a desperate decision. He counter-flooded compartments on the starboard side, deliberately sinking part of his own ship to keep it from capsizing. The West Virginia settled onto the harbor bottom, listing only slightly. Rather than rolling over and trapping hundreds of men beneath her, Miller kept firing. The second wave arrived at 8:40 a.m., more dive bombers. 2 armor-piercing bombs struck the West Virginia. One penetrated the deck and detonated deep inside. Fire spread. The smoke turned black and thick. Men stumbled through corridors they could no longer see. Miller's gun ran dry. The ammunition belt had fed through completely. He looked for more. None was immediately available. The gun fell silent. Around him, the ship was dying. The bridge exposed to the sky. The captain mortally wounded. Fires burning below. The smell of fuel oil mixing with burning paint and flesh. The order came, abandon ship. But Miller did not abandon anyone. He moved back to Captain Bennion. The captain was beyond saving, but other wounded men were not. Miller helped transfer injured sailors through the oil-slicked water pooling on the deck. He carried them to the quarterdeck where boats could reach them. His uniform was soaked with blood, some his captain's, some belonging to men whose names he never learned. The ship groaned. Metal twisted. Somewhere deep inside, compartments flooded. The West Virginia was settling into the mud at the bottom of Pearl Harbor. 130 men would die with her. Another 52 were wounded. Miller kept working. He moved through water and oil. Japanese planes still circled overhead, though the worst of the attack had passed. Sailors struggled in the harbor water, coated in burning fuel oil. Some could not swim. Miller helped pull them to safety. His strength, built in Texas fields and maintained through Navy routine, made him invaluable in those terrible minutes. By the time he finally left the ship, Miller was one of the last 3 men to evacuate the West Virginia. Miller climbed down from the sinking battleship into water thick with oil. The harbor looked like hell reimagined. Black smoke rose in massive columns from 8 damaged battleships. The USS Arizona burned with fires that would not be extinguished for 2 days. 1,100 men were entombed inside her shattered hull. The Oklahoma had capsized completely, her bottom exposed to the sky. 429 sailors drowned in darkness as she rolled. Bodies floated in the oil-slicked water. Some moved. Many did not. The attack had lasted less than 2 hours. In that time, the Japanese had sunk or damaged 18 ships. They had destroyed 188 aircraft on the ground. They had killed 2,403 Americans. Another 1,178 were wounded. Miller swam through the carnage. Oil coated his skin. It burned his eyes. Men clung to debris, calling for help. Small boats moved between the wrecks, pulling survivors from the water. The hospital ship USS Solace took on the wounded as fast as they could be brought aboard. Doctors worked without pause, performing surgery on decks slippery with blood. Ford Island's runway was cratered. Hangars burned. P-40 fighters sat destroyed before they could scramble. The Japanese had achieved nearly everything they intended. American naval power in the Pacific had been crippled in a single morning. Miller reached dry land. He collapsed on the shore, gasping. His lungs burned from smoke and exertion. His muscles screamed. Around him, other survivors did the same. Some wept. Some sat in silence, staring at the destruction. Some looked for friends who would never answer. A sailor approached Miller. A white officer. The man's uniform was torn and stained. "You were on the West Virginia?" the officer asked. Miller nodded. "I saw what you did," the officer said quietly. At the gun, Miller said nothing. What was there to say? He had done what needed doing. Nothing more, nothing less. The Navy's rules about who could touch the guns seemed meaningless now. Those rules came from a world where ships did not burn and men did not die before breakfast, but the rules would return. They always did. Over the next hours, survivors were organized. Roll calls taken. The wounded evacuated. The dead counted. Miller was assigned temporary quarters. His ship was destroyed. His captain was dead. His shipmates were scattered or gone, but Miller was alive. By nightfall, the full scope of the disaster was clear. Pearl Harbor had been devastated. The Pacific Fleet had been mauled. America was at war now, whether it wanted to be or not. President Roosevelt would call December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. In the confusion, in the chaos, in the grief, Miller's actions on the bridge of the West Virginia became just another story among thousands. Sailors talked. Officers filed reports. But the Navy had bigger concerns than properly crediting one mess attendant. Within days, whispers began circulating through the fleet. "Did you hear about the cook on the West Virginia? The black guy who grabbed the 50 cal? They say he shot down planes. They say he saved the captain." The stories spread. Through the hospital wards, through the temporary barracks, through the sailors reassigned to other ships, each telling added or subtracted details, the way oral history always does. Some said Miller had shot down 2 planes. Some said 4. Some said 6. But everyone agreed on the core truth. Doris Miller had fought back. For black sailors serving in a navy that refused to see them as warriors, Miller's story became something more than fact. It became proof that courage had no color, proof that training mattered less than heart, proof that when the moment came, a man could rise above every limitation society placed on him. The Navy wanted to forget, to file the reports and move on, to maintain the comfortable fiction that black men were suited only for service roles. But the whispers would not stop, and soon those whispers would reach the people who would demand answers. The black press, The NAACP, the 1,200,000 black Americans who wore uniforms and deserved to know that heroism looked like them too. The battle at Pearl Harbor was over, but Doris Miller's fight for recognition had just begun. December 15, 1941, 8 days after Pearl Harbor, the Navy Department released a list of commendations for heroic actions during the attack. Officers received citations. Sailors were named for bravery. The list detailed specific acts, specific ships, specific moments of courage under fire. Near the bottom, one line stood out: commendation for an unnamed Negro mess attendant. No name. No ship, no details. Just a confirmation that somewhere in the chaos of December 7th, someone black had done something worthy of note. The Navy acknowledged his existence but refused to acknowledge his identity. This was intentional. The military understood the power of heroes. Every war needed them. Faces for the public to rally behind. Names to put on posters and in newspapers. But the Navy also understood its own racial hierarchy. To name Miller would be to admit that a black man, trained only to serve food, had performed combat duties better than many trained gunners. To celebrate him would raise uncomfortable questions about why black sailors were barred from those positions in the first place. So the Navy remained silent. But silence could not hold against pressure. Sailors from the West Virginia talked to other sailors. The story spread through the fleet. A cook had manned the guns. A mess attendant had saved the captain. A black man had fought back while the world burned around him. The details varied in each telling, but the essence remained constant. Doris Miller was a hero. The Pittsburgh Courier heard the rumors. So did other black newspapers. The Chicago Defender, the Baltimore Afro-American. Newspapers with national circulation among African Americans who hungered for stories of their own dignity, their own courage, their own worth in a nation that denied it daily. The Courier launched an investigation. Who was this unnamed Negro? What ship? What actions? The NAACP joined the campaign. Activists demanded transparency. Black America wanted to know the name of the man the Navy was hiding. 3 months passed. The military stonewalled. The newspapers pushed. Letters poured into Navy offices. Congressmen were contacted. The pressure built like water behind a dam. Finally, in March 1942, the dam broke. The Navy released the name, Doris Miller. Mess Attendant Second Class, USS West Virginia. Pearl Harbor, the black press exploded with coverage. Front page headlines. Feature stories. Photographs of Miller in his uniform. Here was proof of what black Americans had always known. Given the chance, they could fight as bravely as anyone. Miller became an instant symbol, not just of Pearl Harbor, not just of military service, but of the fundamental injustice of a system that would let a man die for his country, but not let him stand as an equal within it. On May 27, 1942, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, held a ceremony aboard the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise. Doris Miller stood at attention. Nimitz pinned the Navy Cross to his chest. This marks the first time in this conflict that such high tribute has been made in the Pacific Fleet to a member of his race, Nimitz said. His words both praise and indictment. The first time, as if courage had only just arrived in black skin. The citation read, "For distinguished devotion to duty, extraordinary courage and disregard for his own personal safety during the attack on the fleet in Pearl Harbor, territory of Hawaii, by Japanese forces on December 7, 1941. Miller was promoted to Mess Attendant First Class, later to Cook Third Class. The promotions were incremental. The Navy's grudging admission that heroism deserved recognition, but even with the Navy Cross on his chest, Miller could not advance beyond the steward's branch. The rules had bent. They had not broken. In November 1942, Miller returned to Pearl Harbor from the combat zone. The Navy had plans for him. Not combat plans, public relations plans. America needed heroes, and Miller, the humble cook who had fought back, was a story the nation could use. The War Bonds tour began December 1942 through January 1943. Miller traveled across America. Oakland, California, his hometown of Waco, Texas, Dallas, Chicago. He spoke to crowds. He appeared at rallies. He encouraged Americans to buy war bonds, the financial instruments that funded the war effort. But more importantly, He spoke at the Great Lakes Naval Training Station to the first graduating class of black sailors, young men who looked like him, who came from towns like Waco, who had enlisted in a navy that still saw them as second class. Miller stood before them in his uniform, the Navy Cross visible on his chest, and proved that heroism was possible even in a system designed to suppress it. The Navy created a recruiting poster in 1943. "Above and beyond the call of duty," it proclaimed. Miller's face stared out from the image, strong and determined. The poster went up across America, in recruiting offices, in post offices, on city walls. The irony was thick enough to choke on, the Navy using a black hero to recruit more black sailors into a service that would still segregate them, still limit them, still refuse to see them as equals. But for black Americans, the poster meant something the Navy never intended. It meant visibility. It meant recognition. It meant that for once, a black face represented American courage without qualification or caveat. In April 1942, even before Miller officially received the Navy Cross, something shifted. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox announced the opening of an all-black naval training facility at Great Lakes, Illinois. The decision was not altruism. It was pragmatism mixed with public pressure. The Navy needed sailors. The war was expanding across 2 oceans, and Doris Miller's story had made it impossible to justify keeping black Americans out entirely. The training base opened. Thousands of black recruits poured through. They were still segregated, still limited to certain roles, but the door had opened a crack wider than before. Miller's heroism had forced it. More opportunities followed, incrementally. Black sailors began serving in roles beyond mess attendants and stewards. Not combat roles, not yet, but technical positions, communications, some gunnery positions on smaller vessels. The Navy moved glacially, but it moved. Yet the contradiction remained stark. Doris Miller, Navy Cross recipient, hero of Pearl Harbor, still served in a segregated military. He had proven his courage under fire. He had saved lives. He had fought the enemy with skill and determination. And yet the system that honored him still refused to integrate him fully. He was a symbol the Navy could use, but not a paradigm it would follow. In February 1943, the Navy changed the title mess attendant to steward's mate. New words for the same limitations. The hierarchy remained intact. On May 15, 1943, Miller reported to Puget Sound Navy Yard in Bremerton, Washington. His new assignment, the USS Liscum Bay, a newly constructed escort carrier. CVE 56, smaller than the battleships but vital to the Pacific campaign. Carriers provided air cover for invasions, transported aircraft, and escorted convoys. Miller was promoted to cook third class on June 1, 1943. The Liscum Bay had a crew of 960 men. Its primary mission was to support amphibious operations in the Central Pacific. Miller's job remained in the galley, cooking, serving, the duties he had performed since enlisting 4 years earlier. The ship left Pearl Harbor on November 10, 1943, joining the Northern Task Force for Operation Galvanic, the invasion of the Gilbert Islands. The Liscum Bay carried aircraft and pilots. The objective was Makin Atoll, a coral ring in the Pacific holding a small Japanese garrison. The invasion began on November 20th. American forces overwhelmed the defenders. By November 23rd, Makin was secured. The troops ashore prepared for Thanksgiving. The cooks on the Liscum Bay pulled frozen turkeys from storage, the same turkeys loaded at Pearl Harbor weeks before, November 24th, 1943, just before dawn. The day before Thanksgiving, the Liscum Bay cruised near Butaritari, Makin's main island. The carrier moved in formation with other ships. The invasion was over. The next phase of operations would begin soon. On the carrier, men slept or stood watch. Some thought about the holiday meal coming. Some wrote letters home. At 5:10 a.m., a single torpedo struck the Liscum Bay's stern. The Japanese submarine I-175 had fired 4 torpedoes at the task group. One found its target. The torpedo detonated near the bomb magazine. Then the carrier's own weapons exploded. 2,000-pound bombs. Aircraft torpedoes. Aviation fuel. The chain reaction was instantaneous and catastrophic. A massive explosion tore through the ship. The fireball climbed hundreds of feet into the air, visible for miles. Men were incinerated before they could scream. Others were blown into the water by the concussion. The Liscum Bay began to sink immediately, 23 minutes. That was all the time she had. From torpedo impact to disappearing beneath the waves, 23 minutes. No time for organized evacuation. No time for damage control. The ship simply died, taking most of her crew with her. 900 men had been aboard. 272 survived. Doris Miller was not among them. Ships from the task force pulled survivors from the water. Burned men, wounded men, men who had been blown clear of the explosion and lived through luck alone. They searched for more, found some. Lost many to the sea. Miller was listed as missing in action. No body was recovered. No confirmed sighting. He had been on the carrier when the torpedo struck. After that, nothing. The explosion and fire had been too intense. The sinking too fast. 1 year later, on November 25, 1944, the Navy officially changed his status to presumed dead. Doris Miller had survived Pearl Harbor. He had survived the recognition battle. He had survived the contradiction of being honored by a Navy that refused to treat him as equal. But he did not survive the war. He died as he had served, in a segregated military, wearing the uniform of a country still unwilling to grant him full citizenship, fighting an enemy abroad while his people fought for dignity at home. The Navy Cross recipient. The symbol of black courage. The cook who became a warrior, gone at 24 years old, swallowed by the Pacific Ocean on the eve of a holiday meant to celebrate gratitude. Doris Miller's body was never recovered from the Pacific. But his legacy refused to sink. In 1973, 30 years after his death, the Navy commissioned the USS Miller, a Knox-class frigate. The ship bore his name across oceans he had helped make safe. In 2010, the United States Postal Service honored Miller on a stamp, one of 4 distinguished sailors commemorated that year. And in January 2020, the Navy announced that a new Gerald R. Ford-class aircraft carrier, CVN-81, would bear his name. The USS Doris Miller, nuclear-powered, scheduled for commissioning in 2032. The first aircraft carrier ever named for an enlisted sailor. The first named for a black American, but Miller's true legacy extends far beyond ships and stamps. He was the first black American to receive the Navy Cross, but he would not be the last black hero of World War II, the 1,200,000 African Americans who served alongside him faced the same racism, the same segregation, the same systematic denial of their humanity. Yet they fought. The Tuskegee Airmen dominated the skies over Europe. The 761st Tank Battalion smashed through German lines. The Red Ball Express kept armies moving. Black sailors, soldiers, airmen, and Marines proved what they had always known, and what America had refused to believe. Courage recognizes no color. Their service ignited something that could not be extinguished. On July 26, 1948, President Harry S. Truman signed Executive Order 9981, integrating the United States Armed Forces. The military that had forced Doris Miller to serve meals instead of manning guns was ordered to dismantle its racial hierarchy. The change came slowly, resisted at every level, but it came. The last all-black unit was disbanded in 1954. The WWII campaign had won both its battles. Victory abroad came in 1945 with the defeat of fascism. Victory at home took longer, decades longer, but the seeds were planted in the war. Black veterans returned home having fought for freedom and refused to accept anything less for themselves. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s was built on the foundation they laid, on the proof they provided that equality was not a gift to be granted, but a right to be claimed. James Thompson, the young man who wrote to the Pittsburgh Courier asking, "Should I sacrifice my life to live half American?" received his answer, not from politicians or generals, but from men like Doris Miller who sacrificed anyway, who fought for an America that did not yet exist, but could be forced into being. December 7th, 1941, a morning in Pearl Harbor. Fire and smoke and chaos. And in the middle of it, a 22-year-old cook from Waco, Texas, dropping laundry and running toward the sound of explosions. He was not supposed to touch the guns. He touched them anyway. He was not supposed to be a warrior. He became one. He was not supposed to be a hero. History decided otherwise. Doris Miller proved that heroism does not wait for permission. It does not ask for credentials or check skin color at the door. When the moment demands courage, courage answers, regardless of who society says is worthy of providing it. His question was never whether America was worth defending. His answer was written in action. America was worth fighting for, worth bleeding for, worth dying for, but only if America could become worthy of the sacrifice. Only if it could look at a cook with a gun and see not a violation of racial hierarchy, but a citizen defending his country. Only if it could admit that the hands that served breakfast could also save lives. Only if it could recognize that the uniform meant something beyond the color of the skin wearing it. Doris Miller died in service to that promise. To an America still becoming itself. To a democracy still learning what the word meant. His death in 1943 was a tragedy. His legacy is a triumph, from the laundry room of a sinking battleship to an aircraft carrier that will sail a century after his birth. Doris Miller's story endures, not because he was extraordinary, though his courage was, but because he revealed an ordinary truth the powerful had tried to hide, that greatness lives in all people, waiting only for the moment to prove it. Pearl Harbor gave him that moment. He seized it with both hands and changed history.